The Old Front Line by John Masefield. This description of the old front line, as it was when the Battle of the Somme began, may some day be of use. All wars end. Even this war will some day end, and the ruins will be rebuilt, and the field full of death will grow food, and all this frontier of trouble will be forgotten. When the trenches are filled in, and the plough has gone over them, the ground will not long keep the look of war. One summer with its flowers will cover most of the ruin that man can make, and then these places, from which the driving back of the enemy began, will be hard indeed to trace, even with maps. It is said that even now in some places the wire has been removed, the explosives solved, the trenches filled, and the ground ploughed with tractors. In a few years' time, when this war is a romance in memory, the soldier looking for his battlefield will find his marks gone. Centre Way, Peel Trench, Munster Alley, and these other paths to glory will be deep under the corn, and gleaners will sing at Dead Mule Corner. It is hoped that this description of the line will be followed by an account of our people's share in the battle. The old front line was the base from which the battle proceeded. It was the starting place. The thing began there. It was the biggest battle in which our people were ever engaged, and so far it has led to bigger results than any battle of this war, since the Battle of the Marne. It caused a great falling back of the enemy armies. It freed a great tract of France, 70 miles long, by from 10 to 25 miles broad. It first gave the enemy the knowledge that he was beaten. Very many of our people never lived to know the result of even the first day's fighting. For then the old front line was the battlefield, and the no man's land the prize of the battle. They never heard the cheer of victory, nor looked into an enemy trench. Some among them never even saw the no man's land, but died in the summer morning from some shell in the trench in the old front line here described. It is a difficult thing to describe without monotony, for it varies so little. It is like describing the course of the Thames from Oxford to Reading, or of the Severn from Deerhurst to Lydney, or of the Hudson from New York to Tarrytown. Whatever country the rivers pass, they remain water, bordered by shore. So our front-line trenches, wherever they lie, are only gashes in the earth, fenced by wire, beside a greenish strip of ground, pitted with shell holes, which is fenced with thicker, blacker, but more tumbled wire on the other side. Behind this further wire is the parapet of the enemy front-line trench, which swerves to take in a hillock, or to flank a dip, or to crown a slope, but remains roughly parallel with ours, from 70 to 500 yards from it, for miles and miles, up hill and down dale. All the advantages of position and observation were in the enemy's hands, not in ours. They took up their lines when they were strong, and our side weak, and in no place in all the old Somme position is our line better sighted than theirs, though in one or two places the sights are nearly equal. Almost in every part of this old front our men had to go uphill to attack. If the description of this old line be dull to read, it should be remembered that it was dull to hold. The enemy had the lookout posts, with the fine views over France, and the sense of domination. Our men were down below with no view of anything but of stronghold after stronghold, just up above, being made stronger daily. And if the enemy had strength of position, he had also strength of equipment, of men, of guns, and explosives of all kinds. He had all the advantages for nearly 2 years of war, and in all that time our old front line, whether held by the French or by ourselves, was nothing but a post to be endured, day in, day out, in all weathers and under all fires, in doubt, difficulty, and danger, with bluff and makeshift and improvisation, till the tide could be turned. If it be dull to read about and to see, it was, at least, the old line which kept back the tide and stood the siege. It was the line from which, after all those months of war, the tide turned and the besieged became the attackers. To most of the British soldiers who took part in the Battle of the Somme, the town of Albert must be a central point in a reckoning of distances. It lies, roughly speaking, behind the middle of the line of that battle. It is a knot of roads, so that supports and supplies could and did move from it to all parts of the line during the battle. It is on the main road and on the direct railway line from Amiens. It is by much the most important town within an easy march of the battlefield. It will be, quite certainly, the centre from which, in time to come, travellers will start to see the battlefield where such deeds were done by men of our race. It is not now, after 3 years of war and many bombardments, an attractive town. Probably it never was. It is a small straggling town built of red brick along a knot of cross roads, at a point where the swift chalk river Ancre, hardly more than a brook, is bridged and so channeled that it can be used for power. Before the war it contained a few small factories, including one for the making of sewing machines. Its most important building was a big church built a few years ago, through the energy of a priest, as a shrine for the Virgin of Albert, a small, probably not very old image, about which strange stories are told. Before the war, it was thought that this church would become a northern rival to Lourdes for the working of miraculous cures during the September pilgrimage. A gilded statue of the Virgin and Child stood on an iron stalk on the summit of the church tower. During a bombardment of the town at a little after 3:00 in the afternoon of Friday, January 15, 1915, a shell so bent the stalk that the statue bent down over the place, as though diving. Perhaps few of our soldiers will remember Albert for anything except this diving Virgin. Perhaps half of the men engaged in the Battle of the Somme passed underneath her as they marched up to the line, and glancing up, hoped that she might not come down till they were past. From someone, French or English, a word has gone about that when she does fall, the war will end. Others have said that French engineers have so fixed her with wire ropes that she cannot fall. From Albert, 4 roads lead to the battlefield of the Somme. 1. In a northwesterly direction to Auchenvillers and Hibuterne. 2. In a northerly direction to Orthulie and Hamel. 3. In a northeasterly direction to Pozieres. 4. In an easterly direction to Fricourt and Maricourt. Between the second and the third of these, the little river Ancre runs down its broad, flat, well-wooded valley, much of which is a marsh through which the river and man have forced more than one channel. This river, which is a swift, clear, chalk stream, sometimes too deep and swift to ford, cuts the English sector of the battlefield into 2 nearly equal portions. Following the first of the 4 roads, one passes the wooded village of Martinsart to the village of Auchenvillers, which lies among a clump of trees upon a ridge or plateau top. The road dips here, but soon rises again, and so, by a flat tableland, to the large village of Hibuterne. Most of this road, with the exception of one little stretch near Auchenvillers, is hidden by high ground from every part of the battlefield. Men moving upon it cannot see the field. Hibuterne, although close to the line and shelled daily and nightly for more than 2 years, was never the object of an attack in force, so that much of it remains. Many of its walls and parts of some of its roofs still stand. The church tower is in fair order, and no one walking in the streets can doubt that he is in a village. Before the war, it was a prosperous village. Then, for more than 2 years, it rang with the roar of battle and with the business of an army. Presently, the tide of the war ebbed away from it and left it deserted, so that one may walk in it now, from end to end, without seeing a human being. It is as though the place had been smitten by the plague. Villages during the Black Death must have looked thus. One walks in the village expecting at every turn to meet a survivor, but there is none. The village is dead. The grass is growing in the street, the bells are silent, the beasts are gone from the byre and the ghosts from the church. Stealing about among the ruins and the gardens are the cats of the village, who have eaten too much man to fear him, but are now too wild to come to him. They creep about and eye him from cover, and look like evil spirits. The second of the 4 roads passes out of Albert, crosses the railway at a sharp turn, over a bridge called Marmont Bridge, and runs northward along the valley of the Ancre, within sight of the railway. Just beyond the Marmont Bridge, there is a sort of lake or reservoir or catchment of the Ancre, overflows, a little to the right of the road. By looking across this lake as he walks northward, the traveller can see some rolls of gentle chalk hill, just beyond which the English front line ran at the beginning of the battle. A little further on, at the top of a rise, the road passes the village of Avely, where there is a bridge or causeway over the Ancre valley. Avely itself, being within 1.5 miles of enemy gun positions for nearly 2 years of war, is knocked about and rather roofless and windowless. A crossroad leading to the causeway across the valley once gave the place some little importance. Not far to the north of Avely, the road runs for more than 1 mile through the wood of Avely, which is a well-grown plantation of trees and shrubs. This wood hides the marsh of the river from the traveller. Tracks from the road lead down to the marsh and across it by military causeways. On emerging from the wood, the road runs within hail of the railway, under a steep and high chalk bank, partly copsed with scrub. 3/4 of a mile from the wood it passes through the skeleton of the village of Hamel, which is now a few ruined walls of brick standing in orchards on a hillside. Just north of this village, crossing the road, the railway, and the river valley, is the old English front line. The third of the 4 roads is one of the main roads of France. It is the state highway, laid on the line of a Roman road from Albert to Bapaume. It is by far the most used and the most important of the roads crossing the battlefield, as it leads directly to Bapaume, which was one of the prizes of the victory, and points like a sword through the heart of the enemy positions. It will stay in the memories of our soldiers as the main avenue of the battle. The road leaves Albert in a street of dingy and rather broken red brick houses. On the left of the road, this ridge, which is much withered and trodden by troops and horses, is called Usna Hill. On the right, where the grass is green and the chalk of the old communication trenches still white and clean, it is called Tara Hill. Far away on the left, along the line of the Usna Hill, one can see the Avali Wood. Looking northward from the top of the Usna Tara Hill to the dip below it, and along the road for a few yards up the opposite slope, one sees where the old English front line crossed the road at right angles. The enemy front line faced it at a few yards distance, just about 2 miles from Albert town. The fourth of the 4 roads runs for about a mile eastwards from Albert, and then slopes down into a kind of gully or shallow valley, through which a brook once ran and now dribbles. The road crosses the brook course, and runs parallel with it for a little while, to a place where the ground on the left comes down in a slanting tongue, and on the right rises steeply into a big hill. The ground of the tongue bears traces of human habitation on it, all much smashed and discoloured. This is the once pretty village of Fricourt. The hill on the right front at this point is the Fricourt salient. The lines run round the salient and the road cuts across them. Beyond Fricourt, the road leaves another slanting tongue at some distance to its left. On this second tongue the village of Mametz once stood. Near here the road, having now cut across the salient, again crosses both sets of lines and begins a long, slow ascent to a ridge or crest. From this point, for a couple of miles, the road is planted on each side with well-grown plane trees, in some of which magpies have built their nests ever since the war began. At the top of the rise the road runs along the plateau top, under trees which show more and more plainly the marks of war, to a village so planted that it seems to stand in a wood. The village is built of red brick, and is rather badly broken by enemy shell fire, though some of the houses in it are still habitable. This is the village of Maricourt. 300 or 400 yards beyond Maricourt, the road reaches the Old English front line, at the eastern extremity of the English sector, as it was at the beginning of the battle. These 4 roads which lead to the centre and the wings of the battlefield were all, throughout the battle and for the months of war which preceded it, dangerous by daylight. All could be shelled by the map, and all, even the first, which was by much the best hidden of the 4, could be seen, in places, from the enemy position. On some of the trees or tree stumps by the sides of the roads, one may still see the camouflage by which these exposed places were screened from the enemy observers. The 4 roads were not greatly used in the months of war which preceded the battle. In those months, the front was too near to them, and other lines of supply and approach were more direct and safer. But there was always some traffic upon them of men going into the line or coming out, of ration parties, munition and water carriers, and ambulances. On all 4 roads many men of our race were killed. All at some time or many times rang and flashed with explosions. Danger, death, shocking escape and firm resolve went up and down those roads daily and nightly. Our men slept and ate and sweated and dug and died along them after all hardships and in all weathers. On parts of them no traffic moved even at night, so that the grass grew high upon them. Presently they will be quiet country roads again, and tourists will walk at ease, where brave men once ran and dodged and cursed their luck when the Battle of the Somme was raging. Then, indeed, those roads were used. Then the grass that had grown on some of them was trodden and crushed under. The trees and banks by the waysides were used to hide batteries which roared all day and all night. At all hours and in all weathers the convoys of horses slipped and stamped along those roads with more shells for the ever-greedy cannon. At night, from every part of those roads, one saw a twilight of summer lightning winking over the high ground from the never-ceasing flashes of guns and shells. Then there was no quiet, but a roaring, a crashing, and a screaming from guns, from shells bursting and from shells passing in the air. Then, too, on the 2 roads to the east of the Ancre River, the troops for the battle moved up to the line. The battalions were played by their bands through Albert, and up the slope of Usna Hill to Pozières and beyond, or past Fricourt and the wreck of Mametz de Montauban and the bloody woodland near it. Those roads then were indeed paths of glory leading to the grave. During the months which preceded the Battle of the Somme, other roads behind our front lines were more used than these. Little villages, out of shell fire, some miles from the lines, were then of more use to us than Albert. Long after we are gone, perhaps, stray English tourists, wandering in Picardy, will see names scratched in a barn, some mark or notice on a door, some signpost, some little line of graves, or hear, on the lips of a native, some slang phrase of English, learned long before in the wartime, in childhood, when the English were there. All the villages behind our front were thronged with our people. There they rested after being in the line, and there they established their hospitals and magazines. It may be said that men of our race died in our cause in every village within 5 miles of the front. Wherever the traveller comes upon a little company of our graves, he will know that he is near the site of some old hospital or clearing station, where our men were brought in from the line. So much for the roads by which our men marched to this battlefield. Near the lines they had to leave the roads for the shelter of some communication trench or deep cut in the mud, riveted at the sides with wire to hinder it from collapsing inwards. By these deep narrow roads, only broad enough for marching in single file, our men passed to the front, to the line itself. Here and there, in recesses in the trench, under roofs of corrugated iron covered with sandbags, they passed the offices and the stores of war, telephonists, battalion headquarters, dumps of bombs, barbed wire, rockets, lights, machine gun ammunition, tins, jars and cases. Many men, passing these things as they went in for the first time, felt with a sinking of the heart that they were leaving all ordered and arranged things perhaps forever, and that the men in charge of these stores enjoyed, by comparison, a life like a life at home. Much of the relief and munitioning of the fighting lines was done at night. Men going into the lines saw little of where they were going. They entered the gash of the communication trench, following the load on the back of the man in front, but seeing perhaps nothing but the shape in front, the black walls of the trench, and now and then some gleam of a star in the water underfoot. Sometimes as they marched, they would see the star shells going up and bursting like rockets, and coming down with a wavering, slow settling motion, as white and bright as burning magnesium wire, shedding a kind of dust of light upon the trench and making the blackness intense when they went out. These lights, the glimmer in the sky from the enemy's guns, and now and then the flash of a shell, were the things seen by most of our men on their first going in. In the fire trench they saw little more than the parapet. If work were being done in the no-man's land, they still saw little save by these lights that floated and fell from the enemy and from ourselves. They could see only an array of stakes tangled with wire, and something distant and dark which might be similar stakes, or bushes, or men, in front of what could only be the enemy line. When the night passed, and those working outside the trench had to take shelter, they could see nothing, even at a loophole or periscope, but the greenish strip of ground, pitted with shell holes and fenced with wire, running up to the enemy line. There was little else for them to see, looking to the front, for miles and miles, up hill and down dale. The soldiers who held this old front line of ours saw this grass and wire day after day, perhaps for many months. It was the limit of their world, the horizon of their landscape, the boundary. What interest there was in their life was the speculation what lay beyond that wire, and what the enemy was doing there. They seldom saw an enemy. They heard his songs and they were stricken by his missiles, but seldom saw more than perhaps a swiftly moving cap at a gap in the broken parapet, or a grey figure flitting from the light of a star shell. Aeroplanes brought back photographs of those unseen lines. Sometimes in raids in the night, our men visited them and brought back prisoners, but they remained mysteries and unknown. In the early morning of the 1st of July, 1916, our men looked at them as they showed among the bursts of our shells. Those familiar heaps, the lines, were then in a smoke of dust full of flying clods and shards and gleams of fire. Our men felt that now, in a few minutes, they would see the enemy and know what lay beyond those parapets and probe the heart of that mystery. So, for the last half hour, they watched and held themselves ready while the screaming of the shells grew wilder and the roar of the bursts quickened into a drumming. Then, as the time drew near, they looked a last look at that unknown country, now almost blotted in the fog of war, and saw the flash of our shells, breaking a little further off as the gunners lifted, and knew that the moment had come. Then for one wild, confused moment they knew that they were running towards that unknown land, which they could still see in the dust ahead. For a moment they saw the parapet with the wire in front of it, and began, as they ran, to pick out in their minds a path through that wire. Then, too often, to many of them, the grass that they were crossing flew up in shards and sods and gleams of fire from the enemy shells, and those runners never reached the wire but saw, perhaps, a flash and the earth rushing nearer, and grasses against the sky, and then saw nothing more at all, for ever and forever, ever, ever. It may be some years before those whose fathers, husbands, and brothers were killed in this great battle may be able to visit the battlefield where their dead are buried. Perhaps many of them, from brooding on the map and from dreams and visions in the night, have in their minds an image or picture of that place. The following pages may help some few others, who have not already formed that image, to see the scene as it appears today. What it was like on the day of battle cannot be imagined by those who were not there. It was a day of an intense blue summer beauty, full of roaring, violence, and confusion of death, agony, and triumph, from dawn till dark. All through that day, little rushes of the men of our race went towards that no man's land from the bloody shelter of our trenches. Some hardly left our trenches, many never crossed the green space, many died in the enemy wire, many had to fall back. Others won across and went further, and drove the enemy from his fort, and then back from line to line and from one hasty trenching to another, till the Battle of the Somme ended in the falling back of the enemy army. Those of our men who were in the line at Hibuterne, at the extreme northern end of the battlefield of the Somme, were opposite the enemy salient of Gommecourt. This was one of those projecting fortresses or flankers, like the Leipzig, Orvillers, and Fricourt, with which the enemy studded and strengthened his front line. It is doubtful if any point in the line in France was stronger than this point of Gommecourt. Those who visit it in future times may be surprised that such a place was so strong. All the country there is gentler and less decided than in the southern parts of the battlefield. Hibuterne stands on a plateau. To the east of it there is a gentle dip down to a shallow hollow valley. To the east of this again there is a gentle rise to higher ground, on which the village of Gommecourt stood. The church of Gommecourt is almost exactly 1 mile northeast, and by north from the church at Hibuterne, both churches being at the hearts of their villages. Seen from our front line at Hibuterne, Gommecourt is little more than a few red brick buildings standing in woodland on a rise of ground. Wood hides the village to the north, the west, and the southwest. A big spur of woodland, known as Gommecourt Park, thrusts out boldly from the village towards the plateau on which the English line stood. This spur, strongly fortified by the enemy, made the greater part of the salient in the enemy line. The landscape away from the wood is not in any way remarkable, except that it is open and gentle and on a generous scale. Looking north from our position at Hibuterne, there is the snout of the woodland salient. Looking south, there is the green shallow shelving hollow or valley which made the no man's land for rather more than a mile. It is just such a gentle waterless hollow, like a dried up river bed, as one may see in several places in chalk country in England, but it is unenclosed land, and therefore more open and seemingly on a bigger scale than such a landscape would be in England, where most fields are small and fenced. Our old front line runs where the ground shelves or glides down into the valley. The enemy front line runs along the gentle rise up from the valley. The lines face each other across the slopes. To the south, the slope on which the enemy line stands is very slight. The impression given by this tract of land once held by the enemy is one of graceful gentleness. The wood on the little spur even now has something green about it. The village, once almost within the wood, wrecked to shatters as it is, has still a charm of situation. In the distance behind Gommecourt there is some ill-defined rising ground forming gullies and ravines. On these rises are some dark clumps of woodland, one of them called after the nightingales, which perhaps sing there this year in what is left of their home. There is nothing now to show that this quiet landscape was one of the tragical places of this war. The whole field of the Somme is chalk hill and downland, like similar formations in England. It has about it, in every part of it, certain features well known to everyone who has ever travelled in a chalk country. These features occur even in the gentle, rolling, and not strongly marked sector near Hibuterne. Two are very noticeable: the formation almost everywhere of those steep, regular banks or terraces, which the French call remblais and our own farmers linchettes, and the presence, in nearly all parts of the field, of roads sunken between two such banks into a kind of narrow gully or ravine. It is said that these remblais or linchettes, which may be seen in English chalk countries, as in the Dunstable Downs, in the Chiltern Hills, and in many parts of Berkshire and Wiltshire, are made in each instance, in a short time, by the ploughing away from the top and bottom of any difficult slope. Where two slopes adjoin, such ploughing steepens the valley between them into a gully, which, being always unsown, makes a track through the crops when they are up. Sometimes, though less frequently, the farmer ploughs away from a used track on quite flat land, and by doing this on both sides of the track, he makes the track a causeway or ridgeway, slightly raised above the adjoining fields. This type of raised road or track can be seen in one or two parts of the battlefield, just above Hamel and near Posiers for instance, but the hollow or sunken road and the steep remblai or lynchet are everywhere. One may say that no quarter of a mile of the whole field is without one or other of them. The sunken roads are sometimes very deep. Many of our soldiers, on seeing them, have thought that they were cuttings made with great labour through the chalk, and that the remblais or lynchets were piled up and smoothed for some unknown purpose by primitive man. Probably it will be found that in every case they are natural slopes made sharper by cultivation. 2 or 3 of these lynchets and sunken roads cross the shallow valley of the no man's land near Hebuterne. By the side of one of them, a line of 16 poplars, now ruined, made a landmark between the lines. The line continues with some slight eastward trendings, but without a change in its gentle quiet, southwards from this point for about a mile to a slight jut, or salient in the enemy line. This jut was known by our men as the point, and a very spiky point it was to handle. From near the point on our side of no man's land, a bank or lynchet, topped along its edge with trees, runs southwards for about a mile. In 4 places, the trees about this lynchet grow in clumps or copses, which our men called after the 4 evangelists, John, Luke, Mark, and Matthew. This bank marks the Old English front line between the point and the Serra road a mile to the south of it. Behind this English line are several small copses, on ground which very gently rises towards the crest of the plateau a mile to the west. In front of most of this part of our line, the ground rises towards the enemy trenches, so that one can see little to the front, but the slope up. The no man's land here is not green, but as full of shell holes and the ruin of battle as any piece of the field. Directly between Serra and the Matthew copse, where the lines cross a rough lump of ground, the enemy parapet is whitish from the chalk. The whitish parapet makes the skyline to observers in the English line. Over that parapet, some English battalions made one of the most splendid charges of the battle, in the heroic attack on Serre, 400 yards beyond. To the right of our front at Matthew Copse the ground slopes southward a little, past what may once have been a pond or quarry, but is now a pit in the mud, to the Serra road. Here one can look up the muddy road to the hamlet of Serre, where the wrecks of some brick buildings stand in a clump of tree stumps, or half right down a god-forgotten kind of glen, blasted by fire to the look of a moor in hell. A few rampicks of trees standing on one side of this glen give the place its name of 10 Tree Alley. Immediately to the south of the Serra road, the ground rises into one of the many big chalk spurs, which thrust from the main Hebuterne plateau towards the Ancre Valley. The spur at this point runs east and west, and the lines cross it from north and south. They go up it side by side, 150 yards apart, with a greenish no man's land between them. The no man's land, as usual, is the only part of all this chalk spur that is not burnt, gouged, pocked, and pitted with shell fire. It is, however, enough marked by the war to be bad going. When they are well up the spur, the lines draw nearer, and at the highest point of the spur, they converge in one of the terrible places of the battlefield. For months before the battle began, it was a question here which side should hold the highest point of the spur. Right at the top of the spur, there is one patch of ground, measuring, it may be, 200 yards each way, from which one can see a long way in every direction. From this patch, the ground droops a little towards the English side and stretches away fairly flat towards the enemy side. But one can see far either way, and to have this power of seeing, both sides fought desperately. Until the beginning of the war, this spur of ground was corn land, like most of the battlefield. Unfenced country roads crossed it. It was a quiet, lonely, prosperous ploughland, stretching for miles, up and down, in great sweeping rolls and folds, like our own chalk downlands. It had one feature common to all chalk countries: it was a land of smooth expanses. Before the war, all this spur was a smooth expanse, which passed in a sweep from the slope to the plateau, over this crown of summit. Today, the whole of the summit, which is called the Reedon Ridge, for all its 200 yards, is blown into pits and craters from 20 to 50 feet deep, and sometimes 50 yards long. These pits and ponds in rainy weather fill up with water, which pours from one pond into another, so that the hilltop is loud with the noise of the brooks. For many weeks the armies fought for this patch of hill. It was all mined, countermined, and remined, and at each explosion the crater was fought for and lost, and won. It cannot be said that either side won that summit till the enemy was finally beaten from all that field, for both sides conquered enough to see from. On the enemy side, a fortification of heaped earth was made. On our side, castles were built of sandbags filled with flint. These strongholds gave both sides enough observation. The works face each other across the ponds. The sandbags of the English works have now rotted and flag about like the rags of uniform or like withered grass. The flint and chalk laid bare by their rotting look like the grey of weathered stone, so that, at a little distance, the English works look old and noble, as though they were the foundations of some castle long since fallen under time. To the right, that is to the southward, from these English castles, there is a slope of 600 yards into a valley or gully. The slope is not in any way remarkable, or seems not to be, except that the ruin of a road, now barely to be distinguished from the field, runs across it. The opposing lines of trenches go down the slope, much as usual, with the enemy line above on a slight natural glacis. Behind this enemy line is the bulk of the spur, which is partly white from up-blown chalk, partly burnt from months of fire, and partly faintly green from recovering grass. A little to the right or south, on this bulk of spur, there are the stumps of trees and no grass at all, nothing but upturned chalk and burnt earth. On the battlefield of the Somme, these are the marks of a famous place. The valley into which the slope descends is a broadish, gentle opening in the chalk hills, with a road running at right angles to the lines of trenches at the bottom of it. As the road descends, the valley tightens in, and just where the enemy line crosses it, it becomes a narrow, deep glen or gash between high and steep banks of chalk. Well within the enemy position, and fully 700 yards from our line, another such glen or gash runs into this glen, at right angles. At this meeting place of the glens is or was the village of Beaumont Hamel, which the enemy said could never be taken. For the moment it need not be described, for it was not seen by many of our men in the early stages of the battle. In fact, our old line was at least 500 yards outside it, but all our line in the valley here was opposed to the village defences, and the fighting at this point was fierce and terrible, and there are some features in the no man's land just outside the village which must be described. These features run parallel with our line right down to the road in the valley, and though they are not features of great tactical importance, like the patch of summit above, where the craters are, or like the windmill at Pozieres, they were the last things seen by many brave Irish and Englishmen, and cannot be passed lightly by. The features are a lane 50 or 60 yards in front of our front trench, and a remblai or lynchet 50 or 60 yards in front of the lane. The lane is a farmer's track leading from the road in the valley to the road on the spur. It runs almost north and south, like the lines of trenches, and is about 500 yards long. From its start in the valley road to a point about 200 yards up the spur, it is sunken below the level of the field on each side of it. At first the sinking is slight, but it swiftly deepens as it goes uphill. For more than 100 yards it lies between banks 12 or 15 feet deep. After this part the banks die down into insignificance, so that the road is nearly open. The deep part, which is like a very deep, broad, natural trench, was known to our men as the sunken road. The banks of this sunken part are perpendicular. Until recently they were grown over with a scrub of dwarf beech, ash and sturdy saplings, now mostly raised by fire. In the road itself our men built up walls of sandbags to limit the effects of enemy shell fire. From these defences steps, cut in the chalk of the bank, lead to the field above, where there were machine gun pits. The field in front of the lane, where these pits were, is a fairly smooth slope for about 50 yards. Then, there is the lynchet or remblai, like a steep cliff, from 3 to 12 feet high, hardly to be noticed from above, until the traveller is upon it. Below this lynchet is a fairly smooth slope, so tilted that it slopes down to the right towards the valley road, and slopes up to the front towards the enemy line. Looking straight to the front from the sunken road, our men saw no sudden dip down at the lynchet, but a continuous grassy field, at first flat, then slowly rising towards the enemy parapet. The line of the lynchet top merges into the slope behind it, so that it is not seen. The enemy line thrusts out in a little salient here, so as to make the most of a little bulge of ground which was once wooded and still has stumps. The bulge is now a heap and ruin of burnt and tumbled mud and chalk. To reach it our men had to run across the flat from the sunken road, slide down the bank of the lynchet, and then run up the glacis to the parapet. The sunken road was only held by our men as an advanced post and jumping off or attacking point. Our line lay behind it on a higher part of the spur, which does not decline gradually into the valley road, but breaks off in a steep bank cut by our soldiers into a flight of chalk steps. These steps gave to all this part of the line the name of Jacob's Ladder. From the top of Jacob's Ladder there is a good view of the valley road running down into Beaumont Hamel. To the right there is a big steep knoll of green hill bulking up to the south of the valley and very well fenced with enemy wire. All the land to the right or south of Jacob's Ladder is this big green hill, which is very steep, irregular and broken with banks, and so ill-adapted for trenching that we were forced to make our line further from the enemy than is usual on the front. The front trenches here are nearly 500 yards apart. As far as the hill topped the enemy line has a great advantage of position. To reach it, our men had to cross the open and ascend a slope which gave neither dead ground nor cover to front or flank. Low down the hill, running parallel with the road, is a little lynchet topped by a few old hawthorn bushes. All this bit of the old front line was the scene of a most gallant attack by our men on the 1st of July. Those who care may see it in the official cinematograph films of the Battle of the Somme. Right at the top of the hill there is a dark enclosure of wood, orchard and plantation with several fairly well-preserved red brick buildings in it. This is the plateau village of Auchenvilles. On the slopes below it, a couple of 100 yards behind Jacob's Ladder, there is a little round clump of trees. Both village and clump make conspicuous landmarks. The clump was once the famous English machine gun post of the Bowery, from which our men could shoot down the valley into Beaumont Hamel. The English line goes up the big green hill, in trenches and saps of reddish clay, to the plateau or tableland at the top. Right up on the top, well behind our front line and close to one of our communication trenches, there is a good big hawthorn bush in which a magpie has built her nest. This bush, which is strangely beautiful in the spring, has given to the plateau the name of the Hawthorn Ridge. Just where the opposing lines reach the top of the ridge, they both bend from their main north and south direction towards the southeast and continue in that course for several miles. At the point or salient of the bending, in the old enemy position, there is a crater of a mine, which the English sprang in the early morning of the 1st of July. This is the crater of the mine of Beaumont Hamel. Until recently it was supposed to be the biggest crater ever blown by one explosion. It is not the deepest, one or two others near La Boisselle are deeper, but none on the Masefield comes near it in bigness and squalor. It is like the crater of a volcano, vast, ragged, and irregular, about 150 yards long, 100 yards across, and 25 yards deep. It is crusted and scabbed with yellowish tetter, like sulfur or the rancid fat on meat. The inside has rather the look of meat, for it is reddish and all streaked, and scabbed with this pox and with discolored chalk. A lot of it trickles and oozes like sores discharging pus, and this liquid gathers in holes near the bottom, and is greenish and foul, and has the look of dead eyes staring upwards. All that can be seen of it from the English line is a disarrangement of the enemy wire and parapet. It is a hole in the ground which cannot be seen except from quite close at hand. At first sight, on looking into it, it is difficult to believe that it was the work of man. It looks so like nature in her evil mood. It is hard to imagine that only 3 years ago that hill was cornfield, and the site of the chasm grew bread. After that happy time, the enemy bent his line there and made the salient a stronghold, and dug deep shelters for his men in the walls of his trenches. The marks of the dugouts are still plain in the sides of the pit. Then, on the 1st of July, when the explosion was to be a signal for the attack, and our men waited in the trenches for the spring, the belly of the chalk was heaved, and chalk, clay, dugouts, gear, and enemy went up in a dome of blackness full of pieces, and spread aloft like a toadstool, and floated, and fell down. From the top of the Hawthorn Ridge, our soldiers could see a great expanse of chalk downland, though the falling of the hill kept them from seeing the enemy's position. That lay on the slope of the ridge, somewhere behind the wire, quite out of sight from our lines. Looking out from our front line at this salient, our men saw the enemy wire almost as a skyline. Beyond this line, the ground dipped towards Beaumont Hamel, which was quite out of sight in the valley, and rose again sharply in the steep bulk of Beaucourt Spur. Beyond this lonely spur, the hills ranked and ran like the masses of a moor. First a high ground above Miramont, and beyond it the high ground of the Loupart Wood, and away to the east the bulk that makes the left bank of the Ancre River. What trees there are in this moorland were not then all blasted. Even in Beaumont Hamel some of the trees were green. The trees in the Ancre River valley made all that marshy meadow like a forest. Looking out on all this, The first thought of the soldier was that here he could really see something of the enemy's ground. It is true that from this hill-top much land, then held by the enemy, could be seen, but very little that was vital to the enemy could be observed. His lines of supply and support ran in ravines which we could not see, his batteries lay beyond crests, his men were in hiding places. Just below us on the lower slopes of this hawthorn ridge, he had one vast hiding place which gave us a great deal of trouble. This was a gully or ravine, about 500 yards long, well within his position, running, roughly speaking, at right angles with his front line. Probably it was a steep and deep natural fold made steeper and deeper by years of cultivation. It is from 30 to 40 feet deep, and about as much across at the top. It has abrupt sides, and thrusts out 2 forks to its southern side. These forks give it the look of a letter Y upon the maps, for which reason both the French and ourselves called the place the Ravin Y or a ravine. Part of the southernmost fork was slightly open to observation from our lines. The main bulk of the gully was invisible to us, except from the air. Whenever the enemy has had a bank of any kind, at all screened from fire, he has dug into it for shelter. In the Y ravine, which provided these great expanses of banks, he dug himself shelters of unusual strength and size. He sank shafts into the banks, tunneled long living rooms, both above and below the gully bottom, linked the rooms together with galleries, and cut hatchways and bolting holes to lead to the surface, as well as to the gully. All this work was securely done, with balks of seasoned wood, iron girders and concreting. Much of it was destroyed by shell fire during the battle, but much not hit by shells is in good condition today, even after the autumn rains and the spring thaw. The galleries which lead upwards and outwards from this underground barracks to the observation posts and machine gun emplacements in the open air are cunningly planned and solidly made. The posts and emplacements to which they led are now, however, nearly all utterly destroyed by our shell fire. This concludes the first part of 3 total of The Old Front Line by John Masefield, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.